is what keeps Maryland from really competing? And we've got a set of presentations here for you that you won't want to miss if you're looking for an answer to that question. So please make your way back to your seats. While you are making your way back to your seats, I'd like to introduce you to our first presenter. We have with us today Andy Bauer. He's the Vice President and Regional Executive of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Let's give Andy a round of applause as he makes his way to the stage. While you're still returning to your seat, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Andy. He told me don't read the whole bio because he's a very accomplished individual. But I want you to know that Andy serves as the Baltimore branch lead external-facing officer for the Richmond Fed in Maryland, the District of Columbia, and West Virginia, providing support to the bank's monetary policy responsibilities, and he also leads the execution of the bank's external engagement strategy. So once again, please welcome Andy and give him a big round of applause.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Zach. I appreciate that. That's really high. Okay, we'll do that. All right, didn't break it. Very good. So there are some slides.
They're working on them.
They're working on them. Okay, so. All right, and there's a clicker, or do I just say next? Say next. All right, so anyways, nice to meet you all. As you can see, we're working this out on the fly. It's wonderful to be here. So I have a set of slides, which I'm going to go through quickly, and I apologize for that. I know you want me to put a slide up there and talk about 10, 20 minutes for each one, because you're into the data that much as I am. So, but I just want to go through and just kind of level set where we are with the Maryland economy. And I also want to make sure that I'm good on time, because I'm doing 10 minutes and no more than 10 minutes. Occupational hazard, I could talk all day, and you really don't want that. So here's the interesting thing. If you go to the next slide. Oh yeah, all the views, everything I say here are my own views, not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. I always have to say that. So here's the thing. It's the Maryland economy over the last 10 years has really lagged the U.S. and our neighbors. The comptroller did a really nice report last year, and so I stole a bunch from that. And not only did they just look at the data, they did some roundtables across the state to kind of get people's input on what was going on in different parts of the district. So here we just have some key metrics about the economy for Maryland and surrounding states. What really stands out, if you look at total GDP growth, it's only 1.6% since 2016, right? And you compare that with the United States, that's 13.9%, right? Or Virginia, which is 11%, or Pennsylvania, that's 6.6%. And so GDP, it's all the stuff that you produce. It's also a metric of how much you spend and how much income growth there is. And so on that metric, key metric, Maryland is underperforming. And if you look at some others, total employment growth, personal income per capita also lags considerably. Where we do okay is real wage growth. And so, again, this is a high income state, high wage, and so with high wage growth, and so that's a positive, but on those other key metrics, we're lagging. So if we go to the next slide, this just shows you over time what that real GDP growth looks like. So it's indexed so that 2016 is 100, and you can just see for Maryland, it's a flat line compared to these other jurisdictions where you're seeing meaningful growth. So I'm not going to tell you, I've got my own theories as to why that is, but I think our students have a much better idea than I do, and so I'm just going to wait. And I'm here just to set them up. That's my goal. So if we move to the next slide. So if you look at the labor market, again, so labor market's really key. If you want to think about growth in anything, you can break it down into two things: your growth in your labor force and how productive they are, right? If we were all wanted to produce a bunch of stuff, today, and then we wanted to produce more stuff tomorrow, we either add more people or we're more productive. Otherwise, we're producing the same amount of stuff. So labor force is key, right? And so here you can see that the labor force growth has been very muted in the state of Maryland. You can see that the losses, we have not actually recovered all the last losses from the pandemic. So that blue line over there is Maryland. And as you can see, this is indexed for 2006. And as you can see that we're still below where we were prior to the pandemic, and then you can see the big differences in terms of employment growth over the last, since 2016. And if you go to the next slide, what's interesting is you look at the unemployment rate and you say, wow, that's great. We have a very low unemployment rate. Well, yeah, it is good that we have less people that are unemployed, that can't find work, right? So that is a useful metric. We always look at the unemployment rate as gauges health in any particular jurisdiction. But it kind of masks some of the things that are going on in our labor market, because as I showed you, employment growth has been very flat since 2016. We haven't fully recovered the jobs that were lost since COVID. And you say, well, those are negatives, but the unemployment rate signals positive, so how do you rectify those two things? And if we go to the next slide, what you can see is that a lot of people left the labor force during COVID and didn't come back, right? And this is a really interesting thing for the state of Maryland. It's very different than most other states into the nation. A lot of people left the labor force for all the reasons we know, but Maryland, they didn't come back. And I don't know why that is. Thankfully, we have the students here who will tell us why. Actually, I've got some theories, but we can talk about that. So if we go to the next slide, and the key thing is not only do people leave the labor force, unfortunately, they're also leaving the state. So out-migration is a key thing. And as I mentioned, if you want to grow your economy, you need people, you need more people, or you need productivity increase. And what you see is that people are leaving we have net out-migration out of the state for the last couple of years. And that's a conversation that we need to have as to why that might be. Within this, I've got a colleague that looked at within the state where the migration patterns are, and there are places in the state which are benefiting. Here on the Eastern Shore, we're seeing more people move into the Eastern Shore. We're seeing more people move to Western Maryland. The big loss is in the Central Maryland. And the reason why, we think that a lot of it has to just do high costs and the cost of housing. So if we move to the next slide, and just to kind of underscore, and I know you can't read this, so I apologize, but this shows where the migration is. Again, this is from the comptroller's report, so you can get it online. Which states, where's the migration vis-a-vis other states? And on the right is where those are the states that we're losing employment, we're losing people to. And out of those, the foremost on the right, we've got South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, Texas. These are places, or Florida, yeah, I think Texas over there as well. These are some of the fastest growing places in the country, right? In the Carolinas is in our district. And I can tell you from there what's going on in the Carolinas: population growth, housing growth, businesses are expanding. Those are very vibrant states in our district. And you have a couple things that are going on. And part of it is, if you go down there, you see they're building a lot of houses. It's easier to build houses. It's easier to start a business. It's easier to expand a business. And there's tremendous growth there. And when you see that in those other places which are receiving population, a lot of housing growth, in-migration, and business expansion. And so these are kind of key states to focus on when we think about, well, why are we underperforming? So if we go to the next slide, and again, I apologize to go through this real quick, but I just kind of want to set the stage for the main event here. And so a key thing we think is driving all of this is housing costs. So this is a study, it was a study done by somebody at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. They've come up with some metrics looking at where population migration is going across metro areas, and they update this quarterly. And what you see here is the line at the bottom, which is green, that's the population from large, high-cost metros. And as you can see, and this again, it's scaled to, I think it's 2000, I think is the starting point. And as you can see, the takeaway from this slide is that the large, high-cost metros are bleeding people in a significant way. And who's gaining those, and who's receiving those people? It's those smaller metro areas that are typically going to be, and rural areas that are going to be lower cost. And so a lot of what's driving this, we think, is housing. And so the last chart I wanted to show you is housing production across, so if we can go to the next slide, is housing production in, or at least permits for the US, Maryland, and Virginia. Maryland is is the purple line. And this is actually one of my favorite charts because I have lots of favorite charts, but this one's really unique because I look at time series all the time. And whenever you have, generally we think in economics that there's markets, there's going to be a certain equilibrium and things are going to trace out over time. And they're going to have a kind of a solid line which dictates, and that growth is going to be dictated by certain fundamentals. And whenever you have a break, something interesting happened, right? And so here you have a clear break in the amount of homes that we build on an annual basis. Because prior to the Great Recession, when the housing market collapsed, we built about 2.5 thousand or 2,500. There was permitting was about 2,500. And from that, you get a certain amount of housing starts. After that, it's only 2/3, right? And that's fairly consistent. And so something happened during the Great Recession and the housing collapse, which made home production here in Maryland much more difficult to do for a variety of different reasons. And we're seeing now for a variety of reasons that housing costs, home prices are up dramatically. And that's what we think is driving some of the migration patterns within the state and across states and across metros. And so when we think about just the competitiveness of Maryland, again, a key factor is employment. And as we travel throughout our district, we spend a lot of time going to different small towns, rural areas, metros. A key thing going forward, just based on demographics, is going to be workforce. And really going forward, it's just going to be a competition for workers. And workers are going to want certain things, amenities, nice place to live, safety and all the things, but they're also going to want an affordable home or to be able to rent an affordable apartment if you're just starting out from college so you can for that first job. And so that's going to be a key issue. And clearly, there's work that needs to be done when you just take a look at this chart. And so if we go to the next slide, that's just a quick summary of kind of where things are. We're lagging in a lot of different ways. The labor market's a key issue here in terms of outmigration, population loss, less people in the labor force that stayed here. You still have a decline in the labor force, and that the high cost is an issue, and part of that has to do with housing costs. And with that, that's been 11 minutes, so I am done. We're going to do one more slide, though. You have an excellent survey here on the Eastern Shore of businesses, which gives you a really good sense of what's the business sentiment here in the Eastern Shore. We have a monthly survey, and if you'd like to participate in our monthly survey, there's the QR code. But we'll distribute these slides so you can have this later and look at all these charts in depth and give me a call in the middle of the night because you're that much into data as I am. And with that, thank you very much.
You can go ahead and have a seat. So, as Andy indicated, he was kind of setting the tone, right? Now we're going to welcome up the true stars of this next panel discussion. I'm just going to introduce you to Zachary Harris. That's their team captain, and he's going to tell you a little bit about the work they've done and the work they'd like to share with you today.
He's much taller than I am. There we go. Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for the opportunity to be here. I'm very grateful to be here. My name is Zachary Harris. Today we're going to be talking about the trifactor growth cycles observed in Maryland and several other states in this region. Like I said, my name is Zachary Harris. I'm joined here by Darby, Trout, Joe Enfinger, Janelle Armstrong, and Lance White. And a special thank you to Claudio Garcia, who's currently pushing through our slides. And thank you as well to Dr. Yao and Dr. Wu, who have helped us immensely throughout working on this project. Next slide. So a short thing about who we are. We participated in the undergraduate Federal Reserve challenge, where we assessed national trends in the labor market and in inflation to essentially form a policy recommendation for the Federal Reserve. I'm proud to say that our predictions ended up ringing true, where a series of modest cuts that recognized the growing concerns in the labor market, as well as the goal to maintain 2% inflation was maintained, and that ended up being what the Federal Reserve actually did. Let's see. Addressing the two key components of that project was addressing the Federal Reserve's dual mandate and maintaining a maximum employment and maintaining low inflation rates. The other important thing for our project was to project the status of the economy in the Richmond region, and this latter subject is what we're going to be focusing on here today. We'll be focusing on the challenges to economic growth in the state of Maryland, observing both private and public sector data. The primary focus from our research will be from the Maryland Survey of Business Conditions, which thank you to Dr. Bauer and his team for creating that. And the other things we will investigate is Maryland's tax climate, income growth trends, population migration data, price parities, and Maryland job growth. These other data sets were compiled from both the Maryland Chamber of Commerce, who I believe are also in this room, so thank you all very much, and other private sector data companies. On the topic of trifactor cycles, there are two types that we're going to be talking about here today. Excellent. These trifactor cycles can start really at any of these points, but we'll just start with vigorous job growth, where typically what you see is when states have vigorous job growth, that allows for an expansion of the tax base, which allows for further revenue to be collected by state governments. And that leads to a fiscal surplus that allows them to lower their tax rates in order to establish fiscal equilibrium. As a result of those lower tax rates, they produce a pro-business climate that allows for more income and more capital inflow to flow into the state and further continue this cycle. The other section, which is much more concerning, would be the vicious trifactor cycle, where if a state starts to experience sluggish job growth, then they will have a shrink tax base, which leads to a deficit that requires a compensation through higher tax rates, which allows for an unfavorable business climate that then repeats the cycle over and over. In this next slide, we see the cash and structural deficits that we're seeing in Maryland specifically, and their projections for the future. The difference between the cash deficit and the structural deficit is that with cash deficits, that's just simply the difference between the government's expenditure and the revenue that it collects, whereas the structural indicates consistent patterns where they fail to meet the expenditures that they collected, or the revenue that they collected. In this forecast, we see that the deficit in Maryland specifically is continuing to project extremity, and the concerns that this brings is that, according to the vicious trifactor cycle, this problem will just keep getting worse and worse. And the next slide, I believe, is for Janelle.
It's the Laffer curve.
Oh, the Laffer curve, wonderful. So this leads us to discussing the Laffer curve, which in essence conveys the idea that increasing tax rates does not necessarily lead to increasing levels of tax revenue. For this hypothetical optimal tax rate, which you'll see in the center with T-star, any rates below this level will not be properly utilizing the tax base that is present. However, any levels that are above this optimal rate will cause a shrink in the tax base due to, I'm sure many of you know, the higher the tax rate, the more companies will flow out of Maryland, thus shrinking the revenue. The question now is, for Maryland, which side of this curve are we on? This is not necessarily a hard number, but through data and an investigation of different trends, we can identify in this presentation which side we expect that we are on.
So jumping into the Maryland Business Condition Survey, we're first looking at general business condition, which encompasses sales, profitability, employment, and market demand. The expected business conditions have been higher than their actual counterparts, and currently business conditions do remain sluggish, and we are kind of expected to see those negatives and that sluggish into 2025. So with current availability of labor with necessary skills needed, it's not growing as fast as expected, and the diffusion index is in the negatives, suggesting that the skilled workforce is shrinking, and there is expected to be a shortage of workers over the next 12 months. For average wage, it's consistently falling below its expected counterparts. and the current wage growth exhibits a downward trend beginning in 2022. For capital expenditures, businesses have not been spending as much on physical capital as expected, and then the diffusion index for current capital expenditures have consistently been in the negative since 2022. And then for profit margin, this is the ratio of change in prices received to the change in prices paid compared to the previous months. For most years, the current profit margin indicator is below 1, suggesting an uncompetitive business climate. And in contrast to current profit margin, its expected counterparts appears often more depressed.
All right. Now we look at the world's favorite figure, real GDP. When comparing Maryland to the states surrounding us, we find ourselves behind all but Delaware. Now, if we go to another key statistic, interstate real GDP growth, we find ourselves below the nation average and below all the states around us. This could be because of low growth in key industries such as agriculture, utilities, art, and entertainment.
On the subject of low growth, nowhere is that more apparent than in the real median household income. You see the different real median household incomes in different states using the legend on the right. And what we see is that these trends show either stagnation or outright decline in many of the regional states. This is significant for several reasons, particularly its negative impact on the tax base in different state and local governments, which further hinders their ability to assist. Another metric that reflects this is the price levels in different regions. As we can see in this graph, Maryland's price levels are noticeably above the national average, which has two key takeaways. First, the fact that different goods cost more in our state relative to others means that the state government has to spend higher to achieve the same amount of usefulness. However, at the same time, as inflation increases and price levels increase within our state, that means that the real debt burden for our fiscal deficit is less severe.
Now we're going to be looking into the job sector in Maryland. So specifically in this region, we're going to be looking at the tech sector. As you can see, it's the second biggest one in Maryland, right behind health. But in the data that I've looked at, it's the fastest growing one, and I feel like we should be looking at it because we're utilizing it poorly. So, as you can see from these two graphs right here, it's going to show that the aging population of Maryland is steadily increasing in the labor sector. It also correlates with the participation rates declining. The tech sector will be important to increase because with the tech sector, it has a spillover effect. With more and more jobs coming in means more innovation, and this innovation can go into other things such as the healthcare, administration, and such forth. This right here behind me is the innovation index. It's kind of a thing that corporates look at to see where they should be putting their tech industries, because it looks at the infrastructure with such as broadband, which Maryland has implemented in other things in the past, while also looking at the highly educated workforce. And as you can see, we are ranked number 4 compared to other states in the union, way higher than our neighboring states. However, if you look at how many jobs that are actually in the labor sector for tech compared to our neighbors, we are ranked 4th. And I blame the barrier to entry for the corporate tax rate that is in Maryland. As you can see with Virginia, we're going to be looking at that later, that their tax rate is far lower compared to its neighboring states, and it has the highest growth of labor in the tech industry, while also having the highest amount of jobs in general with the tech. This is a little graph that we made for our Fed challenge. We looked at the national, it specifically looks at the unemployment rate, and typically we take the 3-month average. It's, economics things, it looks cool, but, it makes me look smart, I guess. So essentially, as you guys can see from the pattern, anytime that it goes over, we have a recessionary term that's happening, such as the 2008 and 2020 pandemic. As you can see, and don't be alarmed right now, we have gone over the threshold. The SOM rule does have a couple of outliers that it does only look at the unemployment rate. Right now, Maryland's participation rate, even though it's declining, is higher than the national average. So as unemployment is rising and participation rate is still increasing, the Sovereign rule will be triggered. In other areas, it won't. But yet, as you can look at in the second bullet point, we are 48th in annual growth with jobs, which is a bad thing to look at with how we have the highest, one of the highest highly educated workforce. And so with the tax increases in the corporate tax rate, I think this is a big reason why we are lagging behind in our, neighboring states.
If we look at Maryland's population growth, we find we had a steady growth until recently, where we had a population increase of 16,000, or 0.3% of population growth. If we look at the trend, we find Maryland is losing a lot of people to domestic migration and only had great growth during the 2021 to 2020 pandemic, during COVID, as people were staying at home. Recent migration loss has only been slightly offset due to international migration. And it's on.
Good. So in the chart here, we've compiled some information that was gathered by the Maryland Chamber of Commerce. And I'm kind of going to be reiterating the story that Mary Kane was sharing with us earlier, which is that Maryland is disadvantaged due to our business tax climate being ranked 45th in the overall, compared to all of the states in the country. And as you can see in the bottom chart, Maryland also has the 10th highest corporate tax or income rate. And however, they rank below the average in corporate tax collections at 33rd place, which indicates that our high tax rate of 8.25% is disincentivizing business in Maryland and decreasing our taxable corporate income. And this supports our theory that the tax rate is most likely on the right half of the Laffer curve. And now in our next graph, we compare Maryland with all of our neighboring states in corporate income tax revenue. And as you can see by the yellow line, Maryland is ranked below 3 of its neighboring states. And I wanted to point out that Virginia having, or as Joe said, Virginia having a lower rate at only 6%, they're still generating much more revenue than Maryland is at our high rate of 8.25%, which could indicate that Maryland's rate being so much, Virginia's rate being so much lower, they're increasing their tax base and the amount of taxable corporate income, which increases their revenue. And while Maryland, with their high rate, they're decreasing their tax base by having a high rate and disincentivizing business in Maryland. And then in our next graph, we compiled the amount of yearly business applications from each state and all of the neighboring states. And you can see the similar trend as Maryland ranks below 3 of the same neighboring states. And but you can also observe that there's an overall downward trend, which is probably due to the hike in the interest rate in 2022. But overall, Maryland, there's a need for a cut in the Maryland corporate income tax rate in order to incentivize business in the state.
To make the Maryland economy continue thriving and remain competitive, we need to address our competitive advantage and the challenges imposed by the trifactor cycle. Specifically, our recommendation is to sustain our state's organic economic growth by utilizing high-skilled workforce and infrastructure to attract and establish more tech companies to grow our labor sector, improving business climate with favorable tax policies and reduced regulation, attracting needed financial, human, and physical capital from outside of Maryland, and cutting government budget defect by helping economic growth and expanding our tax base.
Thank you very much.
Excellent job to this current group of panelists. It is no easy feat to keep 27 slides in under 27 minutes, especially if you have 4 different presenters. So let's give them all a big round of applause. And one more time, I'd just like to also, in addition to thanking the team here from SU, I'd like to thank Andy Bauer for being here with us today. And then a special thanks to Dr. Ying Wu, who was the faculty coach and the professor of economics who worked with these students. So I think you guys did a perfect job. We have 2 minutes, okay? And because you've worked so hard, I just want to ask, is there a quick question from the audience for these students? I'm going to ask the gentleman. I saw his hand first, Greg. So I'm going to go right here up front.
So we saw a lot of data, we saw a lot of slides. Can you summarize all that in like one number? Is there one number that you think kind of reflects the data, the story that you're telling?
I would say if anything, it probably would have to be the corporate income tax rate by far, because that's a story that we're all kind of seeing, that alone is disincentivizing the want to invest in Maryland and our business and our job market, our labor sector.
No, and that's a great question. And while seemingly some of these things seem out of control, we know that there are some ways that we can address that as a state. So I appreciate you. And then I saw one more hand. Go ahead.
I want to know where these smart kids are going to be looking for jobs.
Well, listen, you've got a bunch of potential employers right here in the room. So I'll say this, just like I've said for all of our other panelists, I believe most of our presenters are going to be here for the remainder of the afternoon. Some of them are ready to hit the workforce here soon. Andy might be harder to get. It seems like he's probably pretty well established in his role, but you've got 5 great candidates. So one more round of applause for our presenters. And you guys are relieved. Thank you for everything.
Thank you.
Great.